So as promised, there he is in his home office, Steve Sorensen, the everyday hunter. Steve, thank you for joining us for Deer Talk Now.
You're welcome.
You know, it's been quite a few years. I've been trying to remember how long it's been since you've been writing for Deer and Deer Hunting. Your memory's a lot better than mine. Has it been 20 years yet?
No, it hasn't been that long. Maybe 15 or close to 15.
Yeah.
I think the first I think the first article I wrote for you was a back page article. I titled it "The Fifth Participant,"
Yep.
and that came together as I was standing in a ladder stand, a homemade ladder stand, and had found a the remains of a barred owl. And the mystery was, how did that animal get killed? Many times people think when you see a raptor that's killed or injured, some slob hunter did it, but very often, these animals are or birds are capturing small rodents, and they're dive bombing and twisting and turning, and they'll whack a wing against a limb, and that'll be it for them. So I think that's what happened. But I went through kind of a scenario. Of course, the owl was one. There were a lot of squirrels there. I had seen a coyote there the day before. Crows were there, and of course, I was the fifth participant, just sort of trying to figure this all out. This dynamic of nature that had occurred there, unseen to anybody. So that was the first article, and I thought that was maybe one of the best ones I've written for you.
I vividly remember it now. And that's one thing that I've always enjoyed about your writing, whether it's been for us or all the other outlets where you write, is your depth of contemplation. Like those articles are absolutely the best. I mean,
Thank you.
And we talk about that. We talk about sitting in a stand and thinking beyond the because we always get mired down in tactics, where's a deer going to come from? Is he going to smell me? Yada, yada, yada. And then there's all these little things, the fine details. Those are the things that are very enjoyable. Some of the most, if we listed all your awards, this would be the entire podcast. So I'm not going to list all the awards that Steve has won for his writing, and a lot of them have been for deer and deer hunting. But just check out Steve's website. You're gonna find not only the articles but some of the accolades that have come with it. We just printed one. It's on newsstands right now. The summer issue of Deer and Deer Hunting, summer 2022. I'll show you the cover in case you don't have it. That's it right there. But in the Deer Browse section, which I need to preface that the Deer Browse section has always been a news and notes type of section. Steve has added some breadth to this because some of these articles that he's been writing for us go beyond that. There's some of the most fascinating things, and we kind of bounce them off. But anyways, this one is called Leopold, Latham and Alt. Three basically, would you consider those like the three of the main guys when it comes to modern day deer management?
I think probably, certainly there's some other real important figures in the world today as far as deer management is concerned. But these men, they were unique in that they made some significant contributions at great personal cost. This article kind of came together when I was working on another one for you. We've talked a lot about the history of deer hunting in Pennsylvania since we began the Antler restriction program. It's been now 20 years. And so you assigned me to work on that. And that just began to open up more and more doors and more paths to go down. And I guess I realized for the first time, I'd known about Aldo Leopold and of course Gary Alt, but I didn't know much about Roger Latham. And when he kind of came into the picture, I saw that these three guys had a lot in common. And I think I called you and told you there's just no way I can cover all of this, but I think this is worth talking about. And you said, well, then do another article on it. So
that's right, because there is too much. There
Yeah.
is, especially if you dissect all three of those guys. And Latham, for me as well. For those of you who don't know, Latham was he was basically the wildlife commissioner for Pennsylvania back in the 50s, right?
Yeah, 40s and 50s. Yep.
So we're going to start with, let's start this conversation, Steve, from the beginning with Aldo Leopold in a very brief, give everybody, now I'm going to preface it by saying most people, if they know the name Aldo Leopold, they think of the Sand County Almanac.
Right.
They
Yep.
think of some of that stuff. And the term, I don't know if you came up with this term, but it's spot on accurate. It's in your article. Basically, Leopold is credited today for this idea of religious naturalism. So
Yeah.
let's talk about Leopold. Give us your take on how he started, where he went, and how he was involved in this whole deer discussion.
Well, I don't remember when he was born, but he came to his professional status. Uh, I think it was, I want to say around 1910, but anyway, these three guys, interesting, kind of spanned the century. But he got his first job in wildlife management in Arizona, and he was killing mountain lions and wolves and trying to bring health to the deer herd there, which would have been a mule deer herd. And I remember as a young person, I might have been in high school when I read the story about the Kaibab National Forest and how the predator prey balance get totally out of whack, and he kind of played a role in that. Um, but That's kind of been discredited today because there were many other factors to consider than what he was involved in. But at some point, then they invited him to Wisconsin. I think he taught at the University of
Yep.
Wisconsin, and then got into wildlife management, particularly deer management there. And to this day, there are a lot of people in Wisconsin that still that denigrate him because he did advocate shooting does at a time when deer herds in many parts of the country were being rebuilt. In fact, we'll get into talking about Gary Alt a little bit down the road here, but I was on the phone with Gary Alt, and he played a role under Governor Scott Walker um, of evaluating the deer herd there.
Yep.
Kind of a campaign promise that Scott Walker had made to the deer hunters. And he said when he went to Wisconsin, him and James Kroll and
Yep.
one other biologist I can't remember were working on this project. And he said most of the hunters weren't alive in the days of Aldo Leopold, but he said there was still a lot of vitriol for Aldo Leopold because of his advocating shooting does back then. So, these things kind of stay with deer hunters a long time.
And you're 100% correct. Leopold, I know that story so well because I'm born and raised and lived here my whole life. But two things I want to touch on. The first thing, when you talked about his work in Arizona, it was actually New Mexico mainly
Okay.
as well. But
Yeah.
that lasted for almost 15 years. I mean, I think he started in like 1909. He was basically a professional killer. He hunted and killed mountain lions, bears, and wolves.
Right.
And it's important to know this because then when he became this professor and he became this deer manager, his status was rising because of his knowledge. So the first thing I want to talk about is that whole, when you said when people got upset, you mentioned it in your article. There's an entire book on it, or I should say a chapter of a book called The Crime of 43. And what happened here was Leopold, to the angst of everyone, said, we need to kill does because this is how we manage a deer herd. And we have to manage this deer herd for its health and the forest health. Well, lo and behold, basically a 100-year winter came through. And on top of all that doe killing, bam, winter hit.
Mm-hmm.
And people just said, this guy is nuts and he doesn't know what he's doing. And they had these Save the Deer campaigns. Okay, interesting thing there. If you fast forward to Alt dealt with the exact same thing. And Latham dealt with the exact same thing. And then, so what they say, if history repeats itself, history repeated itself almost like clockwork, right? I mean, from Leopold to Latham to Alt, and then you said those guys come up here and try to, and I'm like, oh my gosh, they're walking into a can of worms. What do you think, though, Steve, as far as what I find the wolf thing interesting because Leopold wasn't a wolf lover. He just understood that wolves do hold a place on the landscape. And also this whole, that term, religious naturalism, how did that all of a sudden just encompass him? Is it a myth of Aldo Leopold, or you know how it is? Basically, I look at it just like you have it's basically your classic public radio listener who is a tree hugger, and they cite Leopold, and they quote the San Colony Almanac. Is it accurate?
Well, I wish I'd have done more study on that. I understand the idea of religious naturalism. I think so many things come into play there. You remember, I think it was the February issue of Deer and Deer Hunting. I did an article on what was behind Bambi.
Yep.
And interestingly, that kind of came along at the same time. Bambi was originally written by a Austrian Jew, German-speaking Austrian Jew, who was kind of a big deal in the literary critic field. He'd written plays, and he was very well known. He wrote it as a serial in an Austrian newspaper. Then the next year, it was compiled into a book. Now we're talking around 1922. And his purpose in it was to describe Jewish life under German rule. So it was an allegory.
Mm-hmm.
Now, most of us in America don't get that because we don't see what was going on back then. But in 1929, it was translated into English. It was picked up by book clubs and sold like crazy. The rights were sold to make a movie. The original guy that bought it figured he couldn't do it, so then he sold it to Disney in 1936. And by the end of World War II, and now we're talking about when World War II was winding down, along comes this cartoon movie named Bambi that also discouraged people from shooting does. So things converged right at that time that that gave people a sense that this natural world had something religious about it, and they were dedicated to stopping man's involvement in this, particularly in the hunting way. So I doubt that Bambi influenced Leopold at all, but and I don't know personally what did influence him, but these things kind of converged at a time when we thought we were on top of the world from winning World War II, and we really didn't need God, and began to find our spiritual meaning as a society in the natural world. And that's maybe about all I can say about that. A lot has happened since then, but Leopold, I think, is kind of considered the father of that movement because I think mostly because of the time that he came along.
I agree with you. I think that's a fascinating analogy as well. If you haven't read Steve's article, it's actually on our website. I think I titled it "The Buck Fawn That Bamboozled America" or something like that. Because it wasn't about that. And if you look at Leopold, the one that sticks with me is the quote unquote fierce green fire. And if you don't know that story, it was a chapter. I think it was. She's an excellent writer, by the way. Mary Beth Lorbecki wrote, it was called A Fierce Green Fire. It's about Leopold. If you read the whole book, it accurately describes everything. But I think with him, like you said with this Bambi analogy, with him, it was more of, now this is just me guessing, which I shouldn't be doing because that's what we're quasi-criticizing people for doing, is extrapolating meaning and putting it into something. But I think it's accurate. I think with Leopold, those 15 years of killing bears and killing wolves and basically all out war, he probably got the realization, plus he was a scientist on the top on top of it all. He's like, this isn't the natural world. The natural world needs some of this. And what he was being instructed to do was wipe it all out. And then when he got to become a prominent figure in deer management, he was trying to educate people who knew nothing about. Basically, they said, "No, we want more deer," And I know Pennsylvania was dealing with this. No, I want to see. I saw 50 deer by 10 o'clock on opening day, and I only saw 20 this year, and that was going on back then. And then this, like I said, this perfect storm of the first basically regulated antlerless harvest, followed by a bad winter. Okay, we did make a mistake there, but it'll bounce back. No, my gosh, they wanted to tar and feather them, and basically, so. Let's move that now from Leopold died in, I think it was like 48.
I think so.
Fighting fighting a wildfire on a neighbor's property, had a heart attack, but he was run through the ringer. And a couple years later now, here comes Latham in Pennsylvania. What happened there specifically? What were was he fighting the same things, but, much farther east, or were there other subjects at play?
Well, I think it was very much the same. I want to back up just for a second to that book you referenced. I think a Fierce Green Fire was the name of it.
Yeah.
Those words came from Leopold when he killed a wolf, and he described that the fierce green fire dying in the wolf's eyes. I haven't read that book. It sounds like it's something I should read.
It's good,
but there's just so much that I need to read that I haven't gotten to that.
She has an entire chapter called the Crime of 43, and that in and of itself, I actually think that's on our website too. That in and of itself is a great read. But
yeah, I did read that. Yep. Yeah, I read that on the website. Anyway, when Latham came in, I don't know altogether what the habitat was like at that time. I suspect that it was a lot of mature timber, and it wasn't as good for deer as what it became once more logging happened. Interestingly, the decline of the family farm plays a role in this too, because when Dad would farm, and he'd have 3 or 4 sons, and 1 or 2 of those would take over. When people began to get more college educations, and some of these young people went away to college, they didn't want to come back home and work on the farm. They got jobs in turf management and on golf courses and things like that. And the farms didn't really have anybody, to succeed them. And it's very, very difficult to make a living farming. Not only is it very hard work, but the economics of it aren't very healthy. So you or I, if we were younger, we couldn't go mortgage a farm and get into farming because you wouldn't be able to pay for it.
Right.
So it basically has to be handed down. When I was talking with Gary Alt, and the subject of the decline of farming, the family farm came up, he told me that actually started, believe it or not, in the 1890s.
Wow.
And it's been happening ever since. Now, wherever I go, particularly around here, I see lots of farms that are pretty much fallow now. Maybe some other farmers will rent out the property for, to grow a crop of corn or grab the hay or something. But basically, farming it's an issue, and it's an issue we need to face as a nation. But it's been declining since the 1890s. We're talking about now 125 years. The family farm has been in decline. Well, when Latham came along, we had a lot of mature timber. When World War II ended and we had all these GIs coming home, there was a timber boom because suddenly we needed a lot more housing, and that cutting of timber created a lot of habitat all the second growth that comes in, a lot of habitat for deer. So in a way, it kind of mitigated the crisis that we were facing in the deer population. As you know, and I'm sure many of our listeners know, deer not only can eat themselves out of house and home, they can eat other animals out of house and home too. When we have too many deer, we have fewer songbirds because the deer are eating their nesting habitat. It's just one example. So when we began to cut timber after World War II, and we also didn't want to kill deer because we needed more of them. We wanted to see those 50 by 10 o'clock. We had, the habitat had a little more room for deer, but they were still growing faster than the habitat could sustain. So Latham saw that. I'm sure I wouldn't be surprised if he personally knew Leopold, but when he became the head of the deer program in Pennsylvania, he tried to address this, advocated for killing more does, and he was actually fired for that, and then went to the Pittsburgh Press, became their outdoor editor, and said right up front he was going to be talking about everything in terms of hunting and fishing, the outdoor sports, including that thing that he got fired for, and advocating for more deer to be killed.
Wow, that's fascinating. Like I said, that was in the 50s. And like you said, okay, so the 50s was a baby boom, 50s and the 60s. Went on their merry way, and we're talking about primarily Pennsylvania. I mean, there was others. New York was part of that. I mean, the states out your way, Ohio, and then you come all the way up across our way. 50s, 60s, things are starting to get better. 70s, even better. 80s, boom. It was just another recipe for success and failure, because now you're really looking. I mean, I know the deer densities in Pennsylvania got so out of hand, and now you're let's just say 30 years removed from the 50s, and those forests are really feeling it. And not only are those deer eating songbirds out of house and home, they're changing that forest forever because they're eating all the understory. Man. Hey, there's that sound again. We know what that all means. It means we're going to thank one of our sponsors. Today's episode of Deer Talk Now is brought to you by 10 Point and the all-new Nitro 505, the fastest crossbow in the world. With speeds of up to 505 feet per second and 227 foot-pounds of blistering power, the Nitro 505 is the fastest crossbow on the market and the most powerful crossbow ever built by 10 Point. I have not shot this crossbow yet. I am going to later this year, but my buddy Brad Fenson has. You might have already seen the videos on our YouTube page and other places on Deer and Deer Hunting. Brad is reporting that this crossbow has a perfect balance of reverse draw power in a platform that is unmatched in its ability to produce speed and power. The Nitro 505 is equipped with the newly designed RX-8 cam system, a 2-stage zero creep S1 trigger that delivers a consistent, crisp 3.5-pound pull, and the easy cocking and decocking systems that dealers recommend most, the AccuSlide. Check them out today at a 10 Point dealer near you, or go online for more information at 10pointcrossbows.com. Mm-hmm. So what was it like then leading up to the 80s and the 90s before Alt got involved?
Well, I guess I'll talk from my experience. I shot my first buck in 1967, and here in Pennsylvania, we had a record deer kill that year. I was seeing lots of deer. It seemed like maybe more and more as the years would go by. And the big question after the opening day of deer season, did you get your buck? Yep. Everybody would ask that.
Badge of honor. Yep.
It didn't matter whether he had 3-inch spikes or whether he was a Boone and Crockett deer. Did you get your buck? That was the most important thing. And people had a hard time letting go of that. It became such an automatic thing. You go to your favorite stand and you wait for the first deer with antlers to run by and you shoot him. That was what's how we defined success back then. Um, Now in the 70s, I was away at college. I come home every year. Um, in our college, Monday was a travel day, so Monday was the open day of deer season. So I'd hunt a half a day, and before heading back to the Boston area. And 2 of those 4 years I was in college, on that first morning, I shot my buck and uh, hit the road. And my dad was the one that got to skin and cut up that deer, and then I would get to enjoy it when I'd come home for Christmas. But yeah, that was a big deal. There were plenty of deer back then, in the 70s. And then when you get into the 80s, I was living in Kansas City, didn't hunt while I was out there, then to North Carolina, in Washington, D.C. briefly before coming back to Pennsylvania in 1981. So from about 75 to 81, I pretty much missed deer hunting. I think I did come back one year from North Carolina. And one year I was in Washington, I came back and I shot a couple of deer during those years. But anyway, uh, there were still plenty of deer, and we loved it. We just, we loved seeing the deer. Uh, we would go out with a spotlight and count deer, and we'd often get to 100 deer out in fields. And I mean, it was just a tremendous time. And some people look back at that as kind of the heyday and the glory days. And it was, if all you cared about was getting a deer, but it wasn't if you cared about the bigger picture. So um, into the nine now, one other thing that happened in the 80s that did, I think, help the deer grow, the population, when we had the gypsy moth come through, for the first big wave of gypsy moths in Pennsylvania. They devastated a lot of timber. Of course, they're attracted mostly to oak, but they'll eat other things too. And we had a tremendous oak die-off in the 80s, thanks to the gypsy moth. They've come up with a new name for the gypsy moth, a more politically correct name than gypsy. I can't remember what it is now, or I'd be using it. But anyway,
Is
uh,
it 10 caterpillars? Is that something else?
no, no,
Okay.
that's another thing. We've had those for a long time, and I don't think they're bad. Um,
Anyways,
Gypsy pejorative, and we're not
yeah.
supposed to call them that. But
Okay.
anyway, anyway, interestingly, and I don't know anybody that can document this or verify it, but a friend of mine, retired game warden in Bedford County, Pennsylvania, Tim Flanagan, enlightened me to this. He said when the gypsy moth came through and killed all these oak stands, the timber companies went in and harvested them on the stump so they wouldn't just rot. And while they were there, they took other mature timber as well. And that created a huge boom in the understory, which was a big habitat factor for small animals, rodents, and birds. And that is when the coyote population really took off. And of course, all that cover was there for deer too, and fawns would have been a big food for the coyote then. And that's really when the coyote population boomed, according to Tim Flanagan. I asked that question of Gary Alt, and he said down where Tim lived and lives, that could have been true, because that was one of the worst places for the gypsy moth, and maybe one of the first places where Pennsylvania got hit the hardest. And that's just Tim's observation. I don't know if there's anything to that or not, but I tend to agree with him. Um, Nobody can really go back and study that scientifically, so that'll, I guess, just remain a theory. But anyway, the 80s, they began to realize again what a big problem they have, particularly as things began to mature through the 90s. Habitat began to mature, and then along came Gary Alt. Now, Gary was the bear biologist for Pennsylvania,
Mm-hmm.
and the bears were doing so poorly in Pennsylvania uh, in the 80s that they actually closed the season a few times, and there were some pretty big limits put on what we could harvest. Um, Gary had done his PhD at West Virginia University in bears and bear reproduction, and they hired him as the bear biologist. And the work that he did on bears, the hunters in Pennsylvania truly appreciated it, because we went from few bears to many. Uh, the bears here, the average litter in a den, a mother's den, is 3 bears, and he says that one cub bear, is as common as 5. So based on that, and the tremendous amount of food, bears truly thrived, and he is universally acclaimed for bringing a healthy bear population. Not only lots of bears, but lots of big bears. We have a lot of big bears here in Pennsylvania. So he seemed like the natural one to take over the deer program. And when he began to advocate killing more does, love just turned very quickly into hate.
And he did that with the under the guise of, I'll never forget the photos. He did that under the guise of antler restrictions.
Well,
And,
there were two.
and quality deer management, with that
Yeah,
as the undertow of the
yeah.
discussion.
I'm glad you mentioned quality deer management, because that was getting big at the time as well. And
This is like mid 90s, right? It was
yeah,
like 95-ish.
yep.
Okay.
And quality deer management is not something that can be practiced on a statewide level, and yet many people blamed quality deer management for this whole idea of killing more does and restricting the buck harvest to a certain antler size. It really was a two-pronged approach. We needed to save the habitat through killing more does, reducing the population, and we needed to bring balance to the herd in terms of the age structure through antler restrictions. And so it was a two-pronged approach: herd reduction and antler restrictions. Herd reduction is something that people still talk about, because we do have a high number of doe tags, but they really stopped the herd reduction part of this program after about 3 years. And right around the time that Gary Alt, he didn't get fired, but he completed 25 years of service to the Game Commission and decided it was probably the best time to retire.
He wasn't on the deer side for very long either, was he?
No. 1999 to his retirement, which I think was December of 05, or possibly, I think it was 05, might have been 04. So yeah,
like 5 or 6 years.
Yep. Yeah. But anyway, his concern was that we were stopping the herd reduction side of this too quickly.
Yep.
And as it turned out, good thing we probably didn't stop it any sooner, but the herd, or the habitat, was beginning to recover. And you can see that in the understory, particularly in some of the wildflowers that deer would gravitate toward. I remember in the 80s and early 90s seeing lots of trillium flowers, a beautiful little simple flower that comes some in red and some in green. And I think there's a variant that has both red and green in it. And I would see quite a few of those, and they'd come in little patches. And by the late 90s, you saw none of them. And that was one of the signs that, and there are other wildflowers as well that are signs that the deer herd was really ravaging the landscape. But we did stop the herd reduction program around 05 or 06, and we still have a pretty high number of doe tags. But the antler restriction piece of this has continued. While I was researching this article, and by the way, I don't think we've mentioned yet that there's more to come in the pages of Deer and Deer Hunting about this whole this whole thing. You know more about this than I do, when this is scheduled.
Yeah,
but,
it's coming up here. I'm not going to give the issue date because people will hold it to me, but it's coming up soon. But let me stop you there for a second, and let's just talk about, because you were there. And I know what happened, but I want to get it from your words. Is so all comes along. He says, "Okay, guys, uh, we haven't learned in 100 years that we can't have our cake and eat it too. You can't see those 50 deer on your 20 acres by 10 a.m. every Saturday, or well, in your case, it was Monday, opening day of gun season, and expect this to keep going. There's going to be a law of diminishing returns." So he comes in. I thought it was quite brilliant, to be honest, because the way he passed it was, okay, from a deer management biologist perspective, I need to get this deer herd down to, in Wisconsin, they're mandated by state law to do it. They have never done it because hunters won't do it. But we got to get the deer population down to here. How am I going to do this? And he said, well, I'm going to appeal, might not be to the most common denominator, but I'm going to appeal to a people's lust for big antlers. And so what was the initial reaction to antler restrictions, generally, in your opinion? And has that done anything now, 20 years later?
Great question. Everybody who went to one of his public meetings, and he held hundreds of them all over the state, attempting to get within 20 miles of every deer hunter so he could talk face to face with them. In every one of those meetings, he would hold up in one hand a 4-point rack, a yearling deer, a year and a half old, its first set of antlers. And then his other hand, he would hold up a nice 8-point rack, probably 125 or 30 inches, representing a deer that was mature and well fed. And he said, would you rather have this or would you rather have this? Well, as I saw it, I didn't think he was saying this, but many hunters did think he was saying that that we're going to be seeing one of these big 8 points or better, just as many of those as we saw of the year and a half old deer. And so people bought into it, because of course, if somebody did get a big deer, which wasn't very common, I think probably in my first 20 years of deer hunting in Pennsylvania, I may have shot a couple of 2.5-year-olds, and the rest were 1.5. I mean, that's just the way it was here. So, everybody thought, well, I guess if we're going to have as many big ones as we see little ones now, I'm on board. And the first few years were difficult because, the deer still hadn't gotten mature. Now, people hated him for both herd reduction and antler restrictions. Many people that went out on, their tree stand or their favorite tree and shot a little buck every year, they'd had 30 years of success by that tree. And now suddenly they saw bucks they weren't allowed to shoot, and they were mad because their string was broken. In the 20 years of this program now, a lot of those guys that were 50, 55 and up have kind of aged out of the hunting population. And the younger guys that are coming along never really had that kind of success, but they're seeing deer that their grandfathers couldn't shoot because they weren't there. And so now many people are saying, and this is hard for people to say, I was wrong. I now appreciate what Gary Alt did for the deer herd.
What is what's the situation with is the population still oversubscribed, or do they have that more in tune right now?
Well, I think for the most part, they do think that we're at a healthy place where if we can just kind of monitor the doe kill up and down a little bit from year to year, we're going to be pretty good. I think timber management, timber harvesting is certainly playing a role in this. But not far from where I live, we have a program called the Kinzoo Quality Deer Cooperative, and I'll mention this in the article that's coming. And there are signs there that maybe we're getting too high of a doe population again. and there's some concern about that. That's not universal across the state. I think by and large, uh, most people think we're about where we should be with the deer population.
Let me put it. Let me ask you this, Steve. I see it here, not only in our state, but even other states that I travel to. And the scenario goes kind of like this. For the most part, and I'm going to preface this by saying I was opposed to any type of state mandated antler restrictions of any kind for any state. I didn't think state managers should be doing that. They should be managing deer based off biological levels. If people want to do it on their own, more power to you. But what I've seen in, let's just say, the past 25 years is, like you said, people who were opposed to it, they might have turned the corner, or they might have aged out of the population, or they might have given up. They just said, I hunt public land. I'm not sitting there holding out for something. I have 2 days to hunt. I've only got 5 PTO days, and I can take 2 to go deer hunting, and I'm not dealing with this nonsense anymore. There was that part of it. But what I've seen is, I think management today on that type of level has put the states in corners, backed them into corners, because you have now a case of haves and have-nots. If you have land, you can hold out, and as far as your buck tags, you have some guys who are doing it purely, and I would say in the Charlie Alsheimer spirit, they're doing it purely in the I'm managing my herd. I'm going to take X amount of does, and however we need to do that, we're going to do it. But then you have a lot of landowners who are like, yeah, we'll take a doe or two here or there, but we're not filling all these 6 doe tags that they gave us, and we're going to hold out for big bucks. And what's happened there, it has allowed some of these larger land holdings, I know a lot of them, that just have overrun deer populations. And then in the surrounding area, you have guys, like I said, who own 20 acres who are hammering every doe that they can because they have the tags for it. So it's kind of created these islands. The population really hasn't changed much. It's just shifted to where the deer are because the deer are gravitating towards these little quasi-safe zones. I see that a lot. I don't know if that's the case out where you're at.
Well, I guess the one thing I would say to that, and I didn't discover this until I was doing the research for that article. I happened to run across a scientific paper that that made the case that when we have an abundance of yearling deer, small deer, young deer that have 90% of the breeding responsibility, these deer aren't really mature yet, and if they're run ragged chasing this high population of does, their growth is actually stunted.
Yep.
And they might take an extra year or two to really become mature. We have a higher, it takes them longer to recover at the end of the rut. And if we have a particularly hard winter, it takes them longer still. And a 3.5-year-old deer now is a bigger and healthier deer than the 3.5-year-old deer was back then, simply because the pressure on these 1.5-year-old deer to breed was more than they could stand.
Mm-hmm.
And so from that standpoint, the antler restriction program is scientifically based. And this is the thing that I think was underemphasized. Now, maybe it was emphasized and I didn't see it, or hunters in general didn't see it. But when we don't put all this pressure to breed on the 1.5-year-old deer, they grow up healthier and bigger in the long run than they would otherwise. So that's, I think, one of the big things that argues for antler restrictions.
If you have that doe population down.
Well, I would say it this way, especially if you have that high doe population. Yeah.
So what is the in just your view, just your one-man view, what is the Pennsylvania hunters, I guess, forecast right now, outlook? Is it positive, negative, in between?
Well, I think it's very positive. I do hear a lot of negativity, but it's interesting. I as a writer, and of course, a lot of it is based on the work that I do for you. I'm keeping my ear to the ground on what's happening in other states as
Mm-hmm.
well as Pennsylvania, and most people only pay attention to their own state.
Yep.
And so, you get along a lot wrong when you have that kind of a narrow view. But in general, I think I think hunters are really happy with the way the deer herd is growing now. I wrote a story for Pennsylvania Game News a couple of years ago. My grandfather shot a deer in, I believe it was 1946, if I remember correctly. It was a post-war buck when during World War II, we didn't have a lot of hunters out there because they were all, fighting in the Pacific and in Europe. And when they came back, we had older deer simply because the hunting pressure was light for the previous few years. And he shot a buck that year that, in my eyes, as a little kid, was the biggest biggest thing possible. Um, Realistically, it was a roughly 140-inch deer. And when I realized what big antlers really were, and I realized it really wasn't that big. Um, Now it's bigger than anything I've shot, but I'm not saying it's small, but kind of aspired to shooting something at that level, and finally it became possible with the antler restriction program. I wrote a story about Grandpa's post-war buck for Pennsylvania Game News, and after I sent it in, I learned that my cousin had shot a deer that might be bigger. And so I wanted to, I ended the story basically saying, will anybody ever shoot a deer that big? And lo and behold, after I sent the story in, my cousin did. So I got in contact with him and found out it was actually bigger. They both grossed about the same, but my cousin's deer was much more symmetrical. And I got them both scored for the Pennsylvania record book, and they're both in there. Um, but we do believe now that shooting a 140-inch deer, which is what it takes to get into the Pennsylvania book, is possible. And I know that's possible every time I go hunting. I never believed that before.
Certainly didn't believe it in the 60s and 70s.
Uh-uh.
Yeah. And the other thing that I find fascinating about Pennsylvania in particular is you compile the state stuff for us for the Deer Hunters Almanac. How many hunters do you guys have? Is it 800,000 or a million?
Well, it used to be, we used to say 1 million. We throw that number around pretty easily. I think we're down to roughly 850,000 licensed hunters.
That's
and
insane.
Probably 750,000 of them are deer hunters.
750,000 deer hunters, which is, you overtook us. We used to have 750. We probably down to 500 here.
Well, everybody's in decline, that's for sure.
Everybody's in decline. Michigan's still up there, but they're dealing with problems as well. But it is very enlightening, and I should say refreshing to hear that the general negativity probably has been filtered out of that deer hunting population.
For the most part, I think that's true. We have some young guys coming up now, guys in their 30s, that are just tremendous hunters in Pennsylvania.
Well, you've featured them in some buckshots columns. I mean, there's
yeah,
good hunters and some good deer.
Yeah. There's a guy over in the central part of the state, the truly big woods area, that killed I can't remember if this is must have been 2020. Killed a 180-inch plus typical in big woods where we don't think big deer live. I know of 170-inch deer. I mean, these are legitimate Boone and Crockett typicals that are coming from the northern tier of counties. A lot of these areas are still pretty remote, and the young guys with good legs are getting out there and doing the scouting, and the deer are there. It's hard to believe how big some of these deer are, and most of the deer, I think, on the typical side of archery hunting, the archery record book here, the top 5 deer have all been killed since antler restriction started.
Wow!
And I think it was 8 out of the top 10 have been killed since then. So we are producing some tremendous deer. There are some people that are still critics, though, and try to answer that question. Some people say, well, the state game commission, they're now catering to the non-resident hunter. They want to bring these guys in and make Pennsylvania a deer hunting destination like Ohio or Iowa, or Western Illinois, or some of these. It just can't happen. I mean,
No.
the habitat is so different here. The land ownership is so different. We don't have the sprawling farms of the Midwest where a guide can come in and lease up land. It's an old state and the land is broken up. But the deer are there. We don't have the soil fertility, which, as you know, is a big factor for growing big antlers and big healthy deer. We're mountainous. We don't, the
Mountainous
fertility.
and small properties. One of my favorite guys on YouTube is I think it goes by Jace Hunter. Have you seen his videos? He's got 2 videos. Opening day, he did them a couple of years ago, but it's opening day in Pennsylvania. And
I don't think I've seen that.
Oh my gosh, we're going to share this link in the comments. But basically, his best one was his first one, and he documented his opening day. Well, he's hunting like 8 acres, and he's sitting in his stand. He's just snickering. He goes, "Okay, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen here." He said it's going to get daylight, and this neighbor's going to pull up on his ATV and ask who I am, and he's done it every year for 10 years. It's just it's fabulous because anybody who's hunted in a populous state and who is adhered to like, oh, I'm holding out, is like, no, this guy's going to come over here, start banging pots and pans because he's mad that I'm hunting because he's an anti-hunter. It's just, and to me, I've never hunted Pennsylvania, but to me, that's probably a snapshot. You're talking 800,000 people. You're not turning that into an Iowa.
No.
You're not turning that into a Kansas. And that's something that I think people can't understand. Why don't we have deer like Kansas does? Because you have 800,000 hunters.
Yeah. Well, plus we have center fire rifle hunting, bottleneck cartridges. Most of these big trophy states, if they allow guns anywhere, it's only shotguns.
Right.
A few of them are now going to straight wall cartridges, but with your 30-06, you can knock down that deer hundreds of yards away. Well, you don't do that in a shotgun state. So we have also most of these states with shotguns. The firearm season lasts maybe it's a week, maybe it's a couple of weeks that are separated. They have different ways of constructing them, but when we have 800,000 people out there with center fire rifles, and it's actually possible to shoot from one hill to another, we kill a lot of deer. We put a lot of pressure on these deer. So, we're not going to become a trophy state, but we have plenty of big bucks. We have genetics for big bucks. You can look back through the history of deer hunting. The biggest deer in the world was once a Pennsylvania deer. 1830, the Arthur Young buck.
Yep.
175-inch deer.
The stuff is the ingredients are there, but you just, I don't want to say you can't do it, but you can't compare yourself to. And well, then we get into the argument. Well, we should go to a shotgun only, or we should listen. Just enjoy the hunt.
Right.
And be happy for your neighbors, even though you might be right on top of them. Okay, we're going to have to come back for another podcast, Steve, because we're not going to be able to get it all in today. But the one thing I do want to say is you guys need to read this article in the June issue. And the next, I'm going to tell you it's the September issue, but don't hold me to that because with publishing deadlines and stuff, sometimes things get mixed. But Steve's next article on this topic is going to be, I'm knocking on wood here, the September issue of Deer and Deer Hunting, because this stuff I find fascinating, but I think going back to that old axiom, if you don't know your history, you're going to repeat it. And if you read this stuff, it's really fascinating how some of those tenets from 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago are still playing out today, because we're talking about a wild animal, the white-tailed deer, which is the most adaptable animal in the world, but also predictable, because if you don't manage it, you know what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So, go ahead, Steve. I'll let you finish.
We should also add that the white-tailed deer is too valuable a resource to mismanage. The deer hunters should know that. The deer managers do know that. But the deer wars are not over. It's a point that I make in, I think, in the article that's coming up, at least maybe a concluding point. We're living in a day where we've lost the uniformity in terms of a worldview. Everybody's got a different point of view now, and up until now, the people that have managed our deer herds are hunters, and they love deer and they want to see deer thrive. We may not, in the future, 50 years from now, the people managing our deer herds may not be hunters, and they may not have the love for it that you and I and our readers and listeners do.
Fabulous point, and you just gave me the headline for this podcast, by the way. The deer wars are not over, so thank you for that. I was going to rack my brain to figure out how to boil this down in one sentence. You just did it for me.
Well, I'm not that good at headlines, and if you ever change a headline of mine, I'll probably appreciate it.
Well, I hope so. Thank you, Steve, for joining us. Let everybody know where they can go find more of your articles on your own website.
Yeah, my website is www.everydayhunter.com. I don't advertise myself as the expert hunter, as the elite hunter. I'm like everybody else. I'm the everyday hunter, and I hope you can learn a little bit from me. I'm sure I can learn a little bit from everybody else out there, but that's my website, everydayhunter.com.
Everydayhunter.com. And I know people are going to ask, can they get one of your custom turkey calls there?
Yeah, right now I'm only taking checks. I'm trying to come up with what I think is going to be the best digital form of payment for me. But yeah, I make a custom turkey call. I think I have about 5 of them on hand right now, which is typical after turkey seasons. I've got about 120, I think, that are well in process. But yeah, you can find out about my turkey call there. That's something I'm really proud of. I'm not even the expert turkey hunter, but since I made my own call, I've been more successful than ever. So check it out.
That's pretty awesome. People are probably be jumping on there right away, so you're going to have to get back in the workshop and start making some more. All right, Steve, thank you.
I only make about 100 a year, and I'd like to get that up, but you can't do everything.
You got to do everything else. You're doing these speaking engagements and writing articles, and don't stop doing that.
Before COVID, I did a lot of speaking at sportsman's dinners, particularly church events, but others as well. And COVID has really crushed that. I hope it comes back, but we'll see.
You hope the business comes back, not COVID.
Right.
Okay. All right, Steve. Thank you very much for joining us.
Okay. Thank you, Dan.
For Steve Sorensen, I am Dan Schmidt. If you are listening to this podcast, please bookmark it, download it, do whatever you need to do to get those, because we come out with them once a week, every Thursday. And if you want to watch the video versions, I don't think you want to watch me too much, but some of these guests, you're going to get to see what they look like after reading their articles all these years. Check them out on our YouTube page. It's easy. It's YouTube.com/DDH Online, or you can see them on Facebook, Instagram, you name it, social media, they're there. Again, for Steve Sorensen, I am Dan Schmidt. Thank you for joining us for Deer Talk Now.